Welcome to Crossroads. I'm your host, Joshua Phillip. Today we have with us Todd Gaziano with the Pacific Legal Foundation, and they are suing government in many, many ways. Something like 100 lawsuits going on right now, and they're fighting against the ridiculous over-regulation of every part of our lives that we're seeing every day increasing, and you're trying to roll that back from what I see, right?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, and I hope some of your viewers know Pacific Legal Foundation has been in existence for over 43 years, and so we're the oldest and most effective public interest law firm promoting liberty. And yes, we just won our 12th U.S. Supreme Court case last June, and we're winning them at an accelerated rate. So we've won 6 of our 12 in the last 6 years. And that's obviously a record that we're very proud of.
Tell us about these victories. What were they?
Well, some of them are in property rights, some of them are environmental, which there's a crossover, and some of them have been in free speech. This one we won in June was against a little township in Pennsylvania that took our clients, an important part of our client's property, refused to compensate her for it, and then said that she could not sue in federal court. So we took it all the way to the Supreme Court. We told the Supreme Court that they had a 30-year precedent that absolutely was wrong and they needed to overrule. And that's a kind of bold move for someone litigating. Normally you try to say you should exempt this particular case from some precedent. We said, nope, this precedent that doesn't allow property owners who have property taken in from local government to sue in the federal court was wrong. Supreme Court agreed, 5-4.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, usually the precedents are very hard to overturn.
They are.
Because they use that to guide, they'll look back and say, oh, well, this previous case was decided this way and it was similar, let's just do that. You actually fought it on the grounds that precedent itself was wrong. That's incredible.
Well, we had been fighting that particular precedent for about 20 years and we saw no way around it, and sometimes the direct way is the best way, but there was a strong dissent from Justice Kagan, and Justice Kagan said that if local governments have to pay for taking people's property, then they can't engage in all this important environmental regulation. And the right response is, of course they can engage in good and silly environmental regulation, they just have to pay for it. So all we were trying to do was establish that if local governments, like the federal government, takes your property and it's supposedly for a public use, they have to pay for it. And when you require governments to pay for their takings, guess what? They don't take them quite as much.
Yeah, they have to have really good reason to take it, I assume. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, well, go figure that they have to pay you if they take something from you. Who'd have thought of such a wild concept, right? Yeah. So you talked a little bit about the idea of fighting against overregulation to uphold liberty. And I think we're in an odd state in the world right now where people don't understand the extent of regulation, the rate at which regulation is being created, and where that is, where that's leading us, but two, how that opposes, say, liberty and individual rights, and how should I say it, how overregulation is a bad thing is maybe the easiest way to put it, because you have some people these days that say, well, shouldn't government just control everything? Shouldn't we just let them have at it? And shouldn't they have power to do what they'd like? I mean, unfortunately, people think this way these days. But yeah, what would you tell someone like this in terms of what you do?
Well, you asked some big questions, so let me try to break it down in a couple little bites. First of all, both at the federal level and at the state level, Americans took some wrong turns in the 1930s, and it continued on the wrong path through about the 1970s. But unlike some people who think it just continues to get worse, I actually think the intellectual climate has changed. But let me now explain what I mean by those wrong steps. So in the 1930s, there were those people progressives have been trying to centralize government under experts for a long time, but they hadn't been succeeding. But as Rahm Emanuel later said, liberals never like to let a crisis go to waste. So, you know, you have a New Deal crisis.
That's a good way to put it.
And so they said, okay, now is the time to shove in our unconstitutional plans. And our unconstitutional plans is to undermine the constitutional separation of powers. And the constitutional separation of powers, as the late Justice Scalia explained, are really the most important guarantees of freedom. He gave a famous, he's put this in some of his judicial opinions, but some speeches where he said, listen, every dictator, every totalitarian government has bills of rights. They're worthless. What really keeps us free are to properly separate power. And that's what was undermined starting in the 1930s through the 1970s. And the idea is let Congress pretend to think it's really in charge, but they will delegate their lawmaking power more and more to regulatory agencies.
Which they are doing.
Right. Yeah. And some of that, by the way, was just really bad, confused, wrong-headed. You know, the idea that experts are neutral. Neutral experts don't have any biases. Actually, one of their biases, even if it's neutral, is for more government, for more power. The school of thought called public choice theory is one of the areas that teaches that public officials' first goal is to increase their own influence, increase their own power, increase their own size. So these agencies, some of which were, you know, started with well-meaning, even if I thought they were unconstitutional from the start, you know, to keep our water safe. But then the agency starts regulating, and then serial regulation and more regulation. Pretty soon, every puddle becomes a water of the United States, a navigable water. Literally, every drop of rain that falls is within their jurisdiction, and they rationalize that they know best. But the fundamental reason that's problematic is our framers understood that our real security is by dividing power. And these agencies now have, Congress delegates in broader and broader swaths. So they pass the feel good, do everything good law to the agency, and agency, you must promote good and defeat bad. So that's your power. Well, regulators love that kind of grant of power.
And looking like you're fighting for a cause gets you votes, right? That's a
right.
part of the idea too.
Right.
Yeah.
But then the agencies, of course, overregulate. They write the law, essentially. They call it regulation, but it's a law. They then decide when you violate it. They then haul you before their agency courts. Well, Madison, as many of your viewers know from Federalist 47 said, the accumulation of all legislative, executive, and judicial power in one hand is the very definition of tyranny. So that's what we had. But we are making progress. We are making progress. So we're suing to try to get the courts to step back in the game of doing what their real job is, which is to enforce these lines. But there's a lot of work we can do in legislatures. The states have similar problems. I'm here at the ALEC meeting to meet with a lot of legislators. I'm a private sector chair of our administrative law subcommittee, where we're talking about model legislation that can begin to restore the separation of powers. But I was really impressed with one legislator who said the most important thing is we shouldn't give away our power. We shouldn't give away our lawmaking power. And I said, amen, absolutely. Start there. Don't make the problem any worse. Legislation, I don't like every law any legislature or Congress passes, but it's always the product of debate. It's usually the product of compromise. It's usually a lot more rational than the kind of dictates we get from these regulatory agencies.
And now tell us a bit about the regulatory agencies, because a lot of people aren't familiar with how a lot of laws aren't written by lawmakers and what these regulatory agencies actually are. This is kind of one of the unseen, unelected forces in our government that a lot of people aren't familiar with.
Well, there are some people may be a little more familiar at the federal level, so I'll concentrate there, but usually in most states, particularly in the large states, it's similar. So you have, at the federal level, dozens and dozens of agencies. OSHA, for example, is Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and they're supposed to guarantee workplace safety. Now, there may be a role for some agency like that, although no employer really wants their workers to get hurt. If you really run an unsafe work environment, you can be sued, so they're not going to get off scot-free anyway. But the problem is that when Congress created that particular agency, they wrote a law that was so broad, they granted so much power, they gave essentially all of Congress's power to legislate on workplace safety to this agency. So the agency is given authority, and I think I'm quoting pretty closely, but I'm paraphrasing, the power to write any workplace safety standard in any industry if it is reasonable or appropriate.
Yeah.
What isn't reasonable or appropriate? So essentially that's all of Congress's power. Congress did not specify, okay, we need this particular type of rule for this particular type of manufacturing plant, we need this particular rule for air quality inside a factory. No, no, no. It, in one statute, gave all of its legislative power to the agency. And some of your viewers may know one of the purposes of we the people giving Congress legislative power is to require them to debate. And we, under the framers, debated lawmaking as the most dangerous power. So we broke up Congress into two houses. We created different constituencies that different members in each house represent. They stand for election at different times. The president's involved, and he has a different constituency, and he's elected at a different time. And they all three have to agree, unless there's a supermajority in both houses. You know the way the bill works. So we created this elaborate process to make legislation rare so that it could be done, but it requires consensus. It's got to be really important. It's subject to amendment. And the idea that we, the people, put all that thought into how Congress operates, and it's very similar at the state level, too. Every state constitution says the legislature shall write the laws that bind the people. But the idea is that, oh, we don't care if they give their lawmaking power away to regulatory agencies. Of course we care. That's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional for Congress to write that broad a law and that broad a grant of authority to OSHA.
And then you have to think of how many unions are petitioning these organizations, how many special interest groups are petitioning these organizations, and when they're not being held to the scrutiny of the voters as well, because you know, who elects to OSHA, right? How does that work?
One of the things that we discovered, and we have a lawsuit right now against the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, because what we found is it's bad enough that Congress grants these huge swaths of lawmaking power that are too broad, but we then found out that power that was given to the Secretary of Health and Human Services was delegated to the Commissioner of FDA, and then the Commissioner of FDA delegated all his authority back in 1991 to a senior employee. And ever since 1991, whoever is the senior employee in a particular office gets to write rules. Well, we've counted 1,860 regulations unconstitutionally issued by that senior employee sitting in that office. And, well, some of them may even be important and necessary, but that person doesn't have constitutional authority to decide those things.
Very interesting. And so when it comes to your organization, you've talked about the past, you kind of talked about the background and present of what you're doing. What is the future? What is the goal of what you hope to achieve? What is the nation you hope to see created through your work eventually?
Well, we want property rights properly protected. We want economic liberty protected as the Constitution guarantees. And we want to restore the constitutional separation of powers. We then will have policy disagreements, but we don't mostly engage in policy. We'll leave that to other people to engage in if the power is restored back to the legislature, back to Congress. But obviously, as President Reagan used to say, liberty once granted doesn't, and I'm forgetting his phrase. Maybe you'll help me. We're one generation away from losing our liberty. We've constantly got to be vigilant to defend liberty, whether it's well-meaning statists, pro-government, anti-market people, or just mixed up, wrong-headed, greedy, whatever. There are people who are seeking to undermine the liberty that we have inherited.
And how true that is, and how true it is, especially when you look at these regulatory agencies, that every single day that they create new legislation, they're tightening the noose around liberty, right? It's a very slow creep of law, and every law takes away a right, or takes away a freedom we once had. Let's put it that way. And sure, like you said, some might be good, some might be bad, but even the bad ones, are usually restricted by, say, threats of normal law. Like you mentioned, workplaces have an incentive for their employees not to get hurt because they get sued. And negligence is also, you can go to prison.
It's also bad for worker morale.
Yeah, generally speaking, yeah.
Employers have a lot of incentives, without government dictating. And, we're looking for opportunities to sue OSHA. We haven't sued OSHA yet. We've sued a lot of other agencies. Sometimes the pinheaded bureaucrats actually come up with a so-called safety rule that's less safe.
I could see that.
Than the agency.
I could see that. Because,
or than the employer would come up with.
Because when you're sitting at the top behind a desk and you're not on the field, and you look out and you create a law that's going to restrict every single person regardless of unique circumstance. Because a lot of times something can be right 90% of the time and wrong 10% of the time, but that wrong 10% of the time can be the matter between life and death. And when you create sweeping laws, sometimes you write off those minute occasions where the law might not be practical. And I think it's one of the biggest downfalls of overregulation, rather than using, say, spirit of the law, right? This idea that you should look at principle and judge in the moment based on the situation. It's a very different way of doing things. And I think that was the principle that America once had, one that hopefully we'll have once again, rather than having technical details down to the most minute detail that you have to, people, really so many regulations that there's almost no way you're not in violation of a few of them, right? The companies have to hire, what do they call them, compliance officers and these types of things to make sure they're in compliance, because nobody can even keep track of the amount of regulation, the amount of law. And that sometimes the minute violations are so minor, yet the punishments can be so severe when it comes to what they're doing that it makes it hard for anyone to even compete in the industries unless they can afford all that. And so, yeah, great work you're doing, I think. And where can people learn more about what you're doing and where you're going?
Well, thank you for that last question. Our website is probably the best, pacificlegal.org. And you can find out more about our many cases, and also about some of our other work to spread liberty in the political branches as well.
Wonderful. Real pleasure having you on the show. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And everyone, please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.